Hello. The press and a lot of people on the left are blaming Boris Johnson for whipping up fury against Keir Starmer, a fury which apparently is his fault. And Starmer, the leader of the opposition, by the way, although I have to admit, if you don't know that where you are, don't worry, a lot of people over here don't know it either. Mr. Invisible could be possibly part of his name. He went out for a walk just outside Parliament, knowing there was a mob outside that had been whipped up by a rabble-rouser called Piers Corbyn. I'll get round to him in a minute. Anyway, Starmer went out and a lot of people were shouting stuff at him, and the press are absolutely convinced that the whole thing was caused by Boris Johnson making a political stab at Starmer during a debate session in the House of Commons.
Instead, Mr. Speaker, this leader of the opposition, a former Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Speaker, he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, as far as I can make out.
There is no surprise, I suppose, to anybody that the Starmer story is more full of double standards than the Ohio Twinsburg Convention. First of all, Johnson made that speech, and what he did was he was refuting something Starmer had said or not said or implied. I don't know. But what he did was he slapped him down by using a rather unfair stab. But since when has politics been fair? He made mention of the fact that Starmer was head of the Crown Prosecution Service when Jimmy Savile was running rampant. Just to explain to my international viewers, Jimmy Savile was a television personality who made much of fundraising for charities. But in between fundraising for charities, he was busy fiddling with kids. And the police and the BBC particularly knew more or less what was going on and did nothing about it because he was a big star. On the one hand, we have to remember that Savile was being protected by the BBC, and we also have to remember that the police were protecting him. And we further to remember that the person there was a complaint, somebody very tentatively brought a complaint against Savile, and the person in the Crown Prosecution Service who was handed the case was an underling of Starmer's. Starmer, so far as we know, had nothing to do with this case, but he was the boss. He was the person who was choosing his underlings and running them, and so ultimately the buck has to stop on his desk, surely. He ran the CPS at the time, and he appointed that incompetent who decided that Savile was as pure as the driven snow, if you'll forgive me for bringing in a white reference here. I'm just mentioning that because the organs, and I use that word deliberately, the organs, like the BBC, have been holding Boris Johnson responsible for the behaviour of his own civil service and his staff during lockdown, when they were having regular social events, apparently, without his knowledge. So, for the benefit of those admirable people who watch this channel, even though English is not their native language, I shall explain the English expression, what's sauce for the goose is also sauce for the gander. And that means, but since both birds are geese, applesauce or whatever goes with both equally well. And so if you're going to blame Johnson for not being aware of the perfidiousness of his staff when he's not there, I mean, he was there sometimes apparently, but most of the stuff that was going on seems to have been going on when he wasn't there. and he is blamed for that because they are his employees and his assistants, then you have to blame Starmer for his obliviousness to the ineptitude of his own staff. So this is what I'm talking about with double standards. As for the mobbing, I didn't notice any particular outrage from the Labour Party when a lowlife threw a beaker of milkshake over Nigel Farage, or when an anti-vax mob went after Michael Gove, and even when a band of nutters gathered outside the home of Jacob Rees-Mogg and harassed not only him but his children, the response was only a little more definite, and that was only because they'd involved children. So when the condemnation came from the Labour Party, it was because this mob had been attacking or, saying nasty things to the kids, not to Rees-Mogg. And certainly people like John McDonnell, a very close associate of Jeremy Corbyn, that he's not being asked to apologise for his intemperate words. Here, I'll play a little clip of McDonald and you can see what intemperate words they are.
On a synchronised basis. I want to be in a situation where no Tory MP, no Tory MP, no coalition minister can travel anywhere in the country or show their face anywhere in public without being shouted.
So that was a little clip of McDonnell directly instructing the party faithful to harass Conservatives. I also have to point out something that organs, and again, the word is deliberate, like the BBC, are not particularly emphasising, that the mob who were harassing Starmer were almost certainly from the left. The discontented left that Starmer has spent a while trying to expel from the Labour Party. People, for instance, like Piers Corbyn, king of the anti-vax conspiracy theories and, well, any other conspiracy theory you would care to mention, who addressed that mob just before Starmer and Lammy had ventured. As I said, I sneezed just then. As my mother told me, when you sneeze when you're saying something, it means it's true. And Starmer and Lammy went out for a stroll. I honestly can't think why. When they knew there was a mob there, and some of the mob were certainly shouting about Savile, which the BBC and other such outlets used to blame Johnson directly for that, but they were also shouting the word traitor. No one on the right would be calling Starmer a traitor. They'd have other names for him: incompetent, invisible, ineffective, amateurish, you name it, possibly, but not a traitor. That's the sort of language the left reserve for all those who are supposed to be left but don't show a sufficient level of socialist commitment. I also heard someone shout out that Starmer was not opposing the government enough, and he was right, but that's hardly a criticism that a Tory would put to him now, is it? So, having been taxed with whipping up emotions about Starmer, Johnson has not apologised. And you know what? He was quite right. If there's one thing we have to admire that stinker for, it's that he has enough sense to know that you cannot, there is no way that you can apologise with sufficient grovellingness to a baying mob of media with an agenda.
Not about the leader of the opposition's personal record when he was DPP, and I totally understand that he had nothing to do personally with those decisions. I was making a point about his responsibility for the organisation as a whole, and I think people can see that. And I really do want to clarify that because it is important.
He did, though, say he wasn't talking about Starmer's personal record, but about his responsibility for the CPS as a whole. As I said, all's fair in love and politics. And that's the Starmer story. Again, it's a matter of the BBC and others using one thing that Johnson has said and ignoring everything else that the other side has said. Double standards. Remember, I'm Grannyopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. Don't forget to push the like button and don't forget to check that you are subscribed, because as I say, YouTube sometimes unsubscribes people without their knowledge. And if you fancy supporting my channel, well, the donation addresses are in the description. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Grannyopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.grannyopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share, share, share.